400 years ago, there was no Florida as we know it. No highways cutting through marshland. No cities built on drained swamps. No canals diverting water to farms and suburbs. There was only water. And inside that water, something was thriving in numbers we can barely comprehend today. The American alligator. Before European colonization began reshaping the landscape, the southeastern United States contained over 220 million acres of wetlands. That's an area roughly the size of Texas and California combined. And nearly all of it was alligator habitat. These weren't scattered pockets of swamp. This was a continuous, interconnected web of marshes, cypress swamps, river floodplains, and coastal estuaries stretching from North Carolina to the tip of Florida, west along the Gulf Coast to Texas. The alligator population during this period is difficult to estimate precisely. But based on habitat carrying capacity studies, researchers suggest there may have been 10 million or more individuals across this range. Some estimates run even higher. 10 million apex predators, sharing a landscape with roughly 500,000 indigenous people who had lived alongside them for thousands of years. The ecology was fundamentally different. In pre-colonial wetlands, alligators weren't concentrated in shrinking refuges. They were everywhere the water was. Every pond, every slow-moving river, every flooded forest, every brackish coastal marsh. And they weren't just living in this landscape. They were engineering it. Alligators dig. This is one of their most consequential behaviors. Using their powerful tails and clawed feet, they excavate depressions in the marsh bottom called alligator holes. These depressions can be 6 feet deep and 30 feet wide. In seasonal wetlands that dry out during droughts, these holes retain water when everything else dries up. 4 centuries ago, the southeastern landscape was dotted with millions of these excavations, each one functioning as a biological refuge during dry periods. When water levels dropped, fish, turtles, frogs, snakes, wading birds, and insects concentrated in these alligator-maintained pools. The alligator sat at the center, feeding opportunistically, but it was also providing a critical service. Without these holes, many species would have perished during seasonal droughts. The alligator, through its digging behavior, was keeping entire food webs alive. This is what ecologists call ecosystem engineering. The mounds of vegetation and sediment piled around the edges of alligator holes created elevated ground. Trees and shrubs colonized these raised areas. In the flat, waterlogged terrain of primeval Florida, this slight elevation was enough to create entirely different plant communities. Islands of higher ground dotted the marshes, many of them built by alligators over centuries of continuous digging in the same locations. The distribution of vegetation across pre-colonial wetlands was shaped by alligator behavior. Not just water and soil. Alligators. Nesting behavior added another layer to this engineering. Female alligators construct large mounds of vegetation to incubate their eggs. These mounds can be 5 feet across and 3 feet high. The decomposing plant material generates heat, maintaining temperatures between 82 and 93 degrees Fahrenheit. After hatching, these mounds often persist for years. They become colonized by plants. They provide elevated nesting sites for turtles. They create microhabitat diversity in otherwise uniform marshland. In a landscape with millions of breeding females, the cumulative impact of nest construction was substantial. The predatory role of alligators was also operating at a different scale. Modern alligators are often studied in isolated populations or managed areas. 4 centuries ago, there were no boundaries. Alligator territories overlapped across thousands of uninterrupted miles. Large males, which can exceed 12 feet and weigh over 1,000 pounds, maintain territories along prime waterways. They fed on fish, turtles, birds, deer, wild pigs, and anything else they could catch. But the prey base was also vastly more abundant. Before commercial hunting decimated wading bird populations, colonies of herons, egrets, and ibises numbered in the hundreds of thousands. A single rookery could contain 50,000 nesting birds. Alligators positioned themselves beneath these colonies, feeding on chicks that fell from nests. This wasn't occasional scavenging. This was a predictable, seasonal food source that alligators had exploited for millions of years. The waterways were also filled with species that no longer exist in those numbers. Atlantic sturgeon, short-nosed sturgeon, American eels migrating by the millions. massive runs of spawning fish that would have provided reliable protein sources for alligators. The carrying capacity of the pre-colonial environment was dramatically higher. Alligators also interacted with a different suite of predators and competitors. The American black bear was far more numerous. Bears occasionally prey on alligator nests and will scavenge carcasses. In undrained swamps, bear and alligator territories overlapped extensively. Florida panthers, before their population crashed to near extinction, regularly encountered alligators at water sources. Observations in modern preserves document occasional conflicts between these two predators. 4 centuries ago, these encounters were routine. The red wolf, now extinct in the wild except for small reintroduced populations, ranged throughout alligator habitat. Wolves hunting deer at the water's edge would have regularly crossed paths with large alligators. This was a complete ecosystem. Multiple apex and mesopredators coexisting across an enormous landscape. Human interactions followed different patterns as well. Indigenous peoples of the southeast had coexisted with alligators for at least 12,000 years. Archaeological evidence shows alligators were hunted for food and materials. Alligator bones and teeth appear in ceremonial contexts. The animals were clearly significant both practically and culturally. But indigenous hunting pressure was sustainable. Human populations were relatively small. Hunting technology, while effective, couldn't deplete alligator numbers across such vast habitat. The relationship was one of coexistence and mutual wariness. Large alligators were dangerous. People knew this. Settlements were positioned and activities were conducted with awareness of alligator presence. But alligators weren't enemies to be eliminated. They were neighbors sharing the same waterways. This dynamic was about to change. European colonization brought immediate and cascading impacts. Within the first 2 centuries, introduced diseases killed an estimated 90% of indigenous peoples across North America. The human populations that had lived in balance with wetland ecosystems largely vanished. But the more significant impact for alligators came through habitat destruction. Wetlands were seen as wastelands, obstacles to agriculture, breeding grounds for disease-carrying mosquitoes. The colonial and early American approach was clear: drain the swamps. By 1900, the process was accelerating. Dredges carved canals through marshes. Dikes held back floodwaters. Pumping stations removed standing water from former swamps. Florida alone lost over 9 million acres of wetlands. Louisiana lost more. The coastal marshes of Texas were diked and converted. The bottomland hardwood forests of the Mississippi River floodplain were cleared and drained. Alligator habitat didn't just shrink, it fragmented. Populations that had been genetically connected across thousands of miles became isolated. Alligator holes that had functioned as drought refuges were drained or filled. The engineering effects that alligators had created over millennia were erased in decades. Commercial hunting intensified the pressure. Between 1800 and 1967, an estimated 10 million alligators were killed for their hides. The species was driven to the edge of extinction. By the mid-20th century, alligators were essentially gone from most of their former range. What we see today is a recovery, a remarkable one. Protected under the Endangered Species Act beginning in 1967, alligator populations rebounded. There are now an estimated 5 million alligators in the wild. The species has been reclassified from endangered to a conservation success story. But 5 million is not 10 million. And the habitat they occupy is not the habitat that existed 4 centuries ago. Modern alligators live in a fraction of their historical range. They're concentrated in remnant wetlands, artificial impoundments, golf course ponds, and drainage canals. They've adapted remarkably well to human-modified environments. But they're no longer engineering a continent. The vast networks of alligator holes that once sustained wetland ecosystems during droughts are largely gone. The raised islands created by centuries of digging have been plowed under or developed. The continuous corridors connecting populations have been severed. What remains is a species doing its best in a diminished landscape. When you see an alligator today, floating in a canal or basking on a golf course bank, you're looking at a survivor, an animal whose ancestors shaped the hydrology and ecology of an entire region. The pre-colonial southeastern United States was not a wilderness waiting to be improved. It was a functioning ecosystem, maintained in part by millions of large reptiles digging holes, building nests, and cycling nutrients through their predatory activities. That landscape is gone. It cannot be fully restored. But understanding what existed helps us appreciate what these animals represent. Not just ancient survivors, not just apex predators, but architects of wetland ecosystems, engineers whose work sustained biological communities for millions of years. The American alligator has survived ice ages, sea level changes, and near extinction at human hands. It continues to survive in fragmented, degraded habitat, surrounded by 80 million people. The question is not whether alligators can adapt. They clearly can. The question is what we've lost by reducing their numbers and restricting their habitat. What ecological functions are no longer being performed? What drought refugees no longer exist? What species that once depended on alligator engineering are now struggling? 400 years ago, the southeastern wetlands were one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Alligators were central to that productivity. What remains today is impressive. 5 million alligators is a genuine conservation achievement, but it's a shadow of what once existed. A reduced version of an ecosystem that was shaped, maintained, and defined by the digging, nesting, and predatory behavior of millions of American alligators. That's the real story of what life was like before the wetlands were drained. Not just more alligators. A different world. One that we can study, partially reconstruct, and learn from, but never fully bring back.